Amen. Well, welcome to Reach Church. So glad you're here with us today, even in this heat wave. It's getting hot out there, but it's about to be even hotter in here after this message. We're ready to go. So it's good to see all of you. In February 2020, speaking of warm places, my family and I, we took a vacation to Disney World, February 2020. It was a few weeks before COVID, shut everything down. We got our vacation in just in time. And at that time, Millie was 4, my oldest daughter was 4, my youngest daughter, Taya, was 2. And it really was a dream vacation. It really was. It was beautiful. Looking back, maybe the best vacation we've ever had. It was wonderful. But the night before we went to the Magic Kingdom for the first time, we had some Papa John's pizza in our room. And yeah, some garlic sauce, amen to that. But anyway, that will be a big part of the story in just a few minutes, okay? So we get there the next day, the sun's shining. We go to the Magic Kingdom. We want to go see the castle show. There's a castle show with Mickey Mouse right in front of the castle, So we go right there. We get right in line. We're right up front, and we're ready to see the show. Start vacation. It's a beautiful day. Sun shining. My 2 little girls ready to see Mickey Mouse. Like the perfect scene. Then I pick up Taya out of her stroller. And let's just say it was the revenge of the Papa John's. It got a little saucy in her stroller. So you parents know that feeling. So, I went into full Bedford County mode. That's where I grew up, full Bedford County mode. And I'm like, you know what, just undress her, wipe her off, I'll just hold her. She'll be fine. She's got her diaper on, big deal. Well, unfortunately for us, the Disney people did care a bit. They didn't want to see a dad holding up his naked toddler in front of the castle with just her diaper on, So they're like, sir, you need to actually dress your child, So Gwen's like, we're gonna miss the show. So she runs to one of the stores there, and I think she paid about $2,000 for a new onesie for Taya. But anyway, it was worth it because we got there just in time for the show to start. I said, this is how I fight my battles, baby. We're here, Mickey Mouse. There it is, enjoy it. Then part 2, same day, just a few hours later, this part involved my other daughter. A few hours later, they have this parade. And it's like this dance party, so they have all these characters and, it's Mickey, they're all dancing around. I'm like, Millie's gonna love this. I'm gonna watch her dance with her favorite characters. It's gonna be great. And then all this entertainment is coming down and Millie's just standing there like moping. I'm like, there's no moping at Disney World. There's no crying in baseball, but there's definitely no moping at Disney World. I paid way too much for this, and you're gonna have fun. No matter what we're gonna make memories. Yeah, that's what I paid for. Have fun, So we kind of ask her, what is going on? Why are you not having fun? Well, we forgot that we told Millie that we had this Frozen ride Fast Pass. And if you're not familiar with Disney, a Fast Pass is a way that you cannot wait in line for hours. It's like a reservation for a ride. So we had one for the Frozen ride at Epcot. And Frozen at that time was really one of Millie's favorite rides. So we sit her down and we just reassure her, Millie, there's no way, Gwen's like, there's no way your father is going to miss the chance to skip a line, okay? We will definitely be at the Frozen ride in time. And it was crazy because once we told her that, once we reassured her that look, Millie, you're only 4. We have everything planned out. Everything's gonna go okay. You're gonna get to do whatever you want. It freed her. I mean, she was really worried about missing out on something and planning this and planning that. But once we told her and assured her that we had it, it really freed her. So ironically, from the experience with the Frozen Fast Pass ride, Millie was able to just let it go. A few of you got the joke, yeah. Just let it go. If you're not thank you for the boo. If you're not a Disney fan, Frozen, let it go. Let it go is like the song, let it go, okay. So Millie was able to just let it go, let it go. And that's the title of the message today. Let it go, let it go. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn them to 2 Samuel chapter 15. This is part 19 of our series on the life of David. Can you believe it? Part 19. Wow, 19. Part 19. And if you remember from last week, David's household has descended into chaos. His son Absalom killed his brother Amnon. And as a result, Absalom has spent years away in exile. But David, we saw at the end of last week, he eventually agrees to have Absalom come back to Jerusalem. And we concluded last week with the last verse of chapter 14. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So as the events of chapter 15 will prove even further, this kiss between David and Absalom, it really meant nothing. It was empty. There was no level of real reconciliation between the two. There was no meaning to it. And that's made even more evident in how chapter 15 begins. Look at chapter 15, verse 1. It says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. So immediately after this kiss between Absalom and his father David, Absalom strategically begins to overthrow his own father's kingdom. He starts by just essentially pretending to be the king. He is intentionally projecting the image of king. That's why he gets these horses and chariots and 50 people to go before him. And now this is coupled with the looks he already has to be the king. We skipped over this last week, but look at chapter 14, verse 25. Now in all of Israel, there was no one much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. I can certainly relate to him. Right, Gwenny? Yeah. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it. When it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head. What's with this guy? 200 shekels by the king's weight. So the point is, he had the looks. He had the looks to be the king. And now he's coupling his good appearance, his favorable appearance, with this projection, this image of king with these chariots and horses. But all he's doing is projecting an image. There's no substance behind this image. He's pretending to be someone or something he's not. He's inserting himself into a calling that's not his. I wonder, are you pursuing what you want for you or what God wants for you and what he has for you? Are you trying to create your own image of yourself, or are you simply just resting in the image that God has already created you in? Are you seeking to live out what God has called you to do? Or are you trying to insert yourself in a calling that God has called somebody else to do? Psalm 20, verse 7 fittingly says this: some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. So I wonder, are you creating your own image of yourself instead of, trusting in chariots and horses, creating your own image of yourself? Or are you simply resting in the image that God has already created you in? Look what Absalom does next as he's furthering this image of king. Verse 2. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you. Then Absalom would say, oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. So Absalom might be projecting this image of king by positioning himself at the main gate, administering justice. But again, did you notice that there's no substance in anything that Absalom is doing here? He essentially tells everyone that comes, oh, your claim is a good one. I agree with you. If I'd be the judge, I'd rule in your favor. And you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car, right? And remember, he's just doing this to everyone. Everyone. There's no substance in what Absalom is doing. There's no wisdom. He's just being a yes man to everyone to win everyone's approval. He might be projecting the image of king, but he's not executing justice in a way that a king is called to do. 2 Samuel chapter 8 says this about his father. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. David did this with substance, but Absalom was worried more about his image than his substance. So his version of justice is simply saying, your claims are good and right, and your claims are good and right, and your claims are good and right. Verse 6, it then says, thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So with chariots and horses and favorability, being a yes man, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel through this image that he projected. Now, we could focus on how Absalom was able to, what Absalom did to steal the hearts of the men of Israel. But let's think about this question. How did the men of Israel allow Absalom to steal their hearts? Let's think about it from that perspective. How'd this happen? Well, I was thinking, and I think it happened the same way in which we allow someone or something to steal our hearts. Listen, here's the reality. I want you to listen closely. We value image over substance, don't we? We value cravings over a steady diet. We value validation and affirmation over accountability, truth, and being challenged. We value the next best thing instead of the steadfast and faithful thing. We value popularity and charm over character. That is why Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And that's why for us today, Proverbs 4:23 is so important. It says, above all else, what? Guard your heart. Guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. Absalom was successful in stealing hearts because he appealed to the fleshly inclinations of the Israelites who value image over substance and all those things that I mentioned before. So I have to ask you today, are you allowing your heart to be allured by the Absaloms out there? The image things instead of the substance things? Listen, it happens quickly, very quickly. We can be so easily allured and just led astray. So that's why it's essential, church, to guard your heart. Guard your heart. And in Romans 12:2 says as well, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Guard your heart. Guard your heart. Because unfortunately, the Israelites, they fail to do this, and they're easily allured by the image that Absalom projects. And so he steals the hearts of the people of Israel. And verse 7 says this, And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, 4 years he does this for, by the way, 4 years. Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord. The king said to him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron. With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, and the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. So after he steals the people's hearts for 4 years, Absalom makes his way to this place called Hebron to organize the final stage of this rebellion to usurp his father's kingdom. Quick kind of side note context, why does he go to Hebron to do this for this final stage? Well, Hebron was the place, if you remember, it was the place where David was anointed as king. And now Absalom returns to the same place where David was anointed as king to make a statement that he is now the king. And so at this point, David really has no choice but to flee Jerusalem. One commentator put it this way, he said, David was completely unprepared. He had no reliable intelligence on the strength of the rebellion and could not simply assume that all his soldiers would fight for him. David's decision to withdraw and in effect declare Jerusalem an open city was strategically sound and a tactical necessity. So verse 17, it says, and the king went out and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. So the last house was just a place on the outer wall of Jerusalem. And all of his servants passed by him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath passed on before the king. Then the king said to Ittai, the Gittite, why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your home. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us? Since I go, I know not where. Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you. So as David is fleeing Jerusalem, the Cherethites and the Perethites are still with him. They're his bodyguards, by the way. These are a group of people that were his bodyguards. And also with him were these 600 Gittites. And as you saw in that passage, they were led by a man named Ittai. And David eventually told Ittai, look, you're a foreigner. This isn't your fight. You don't have to stay with me. Just go back to the city. But look at how Ittai responds in verse 21. But Ittai answered the Lord. He said, as the Lord lives, as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be. Wow. Are there any country music fans out there? Good, 4 people. Four people like country music. Where I grew up, there were like 3 radio stations and 2.5 of them were country music, all right? Shout out to Froggy 98.1. Yeah, anyway. There's a country song. It's called, You Find Out Who Your Friends Are. Yeah. Listen to the lyrics. I love this song. This is a good country song. Run your car off the side of the road. That's a good start. Get stuck in a ditch way out in the middle of nowhere. Get yourself in a bind. Lose the shirt off your back. Need a floor, need a couch, need a bus fare. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the cream is gonna rise. This is what you really don't know. This is where the truth don't lie. You find out who your friends are. Somebody's gonna drop everything, run out and crank up their car, hit the gas, get there fast, never stop to think what's in it for me, or it's way too far. they just show up with their big heart. You find out who your friends are. Everybody wants to, here's a good one. Everybody wants to slap your back, wants to shake your hand when you're on top of the mountain. But let one of those rocks give way. Then you slide back down and look up and see who's around. Then you find out who your friends are. See, when David was the king, when he was popular, loved, admired, respected, I'm sure he had plenty of friends, right? Plenty of loyal friends. He was the king. And being close to David, it gave you something. It gave you influence, gave you respect, gave you a voice. But now as the kingdom has been taken over and David is fleeing Jerusalem, that's when you find out who your friends are. Listen to this quote. The people who you can call your friends don't abandon you in your great time of need. Neither do they stop being a friend when you have nothing to offer them. And yet at this very moment, God sends this man named Ittai to encourage David. I know we've all felt the heartbreak of being abandoned, right? Walked out on, betrayed, forgotten. But as David is walking away rejected, at just the right time, God places this man named Ittai in David's path to remind him that you might have been rejected by them. They might have walked out on you, but God has not rejected David. God hasn't left him. He's still there and he's not going away. Do you know what the name Ittai means? You know what it means? It actually means the Lord is with me. So let me get this straight. God sends this man to David when everyone is walking out on him, named Ittai, whose name means the Lord is with me. And so I gotta remind you today, I've gotta remind you, you might feel rejected, maybe by God, maybe by other people. Maybe you think it's over. Maybe you really know what it feels like as David is walking away from something. And maybe you're ready to give up. Maybe your heart has been broken. You might be walking through the valley of the shadow of death right now. But I've got to remind you that your head is still anointed with oil and your cup still overflows. God is with you. God is with you. Who cares about the people who left? God is with you. And that's all you need. The Lord is with the Lord is with me. Ittai is here. Ittai is here. God will always send you Ittai in the form of his very presence. What a friend we have in Jesus. The Lord is with me. The Lord is with me. And he is still by your side today. And as Ittai enters this story at this very moment and says these words to David, that I'm not going anywhere, it's at this point that the story begins to take a turn. Maybe it was through these words of Ittai that David was reminded of the promise that God gave to him when he said, "In your house, in your kingdom, shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Somebody needs to be reminded today that the promise still stands. The promise still stands. The promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, and this is my confidence. You've never failed me yet. No, you've never failed me yet. You can't forget it. He's never failed you yet, and the promise still stands. Ittai is still there. The Lord is with you. Ittai is still by your side. Let the other people walk away. Ittai is still by your side. So after Ittai encourages David with his words, David, he's met with even more faithful friends. And Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites. That's a really cool name, by the way, Zadok. I'm looking for baby boy names right now. Maybe Zadok is a good one. Zadok. It's a Zadok Schoenberger. I like it. I got a no from the front row. That's all that matters. Yeah, you don't get a say. You're just the uncle. And they set down the ark of God. Abiathar and Zadok, they come with the ark of God, the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. So Abiathar and Zadok were Israel's priests. So when they come to David, it communicated that the spiritual authority was with David and not with the growing conspiracy with Absalom. The priests brought the ark of the covenant to David. They brought the ark. It was a symbol, remember, the Ark of the Covenant, we've seen this before, but it's a symbol of God's presence and God's blessing. For the ark to go out of Jerusalem with David would have symbolized God's alignment with the forlorn king, and in the eyes of many people, would have ensured David's victory in battle through divine power. David's got the ark, what are you gonna do? Now everyone's like, why not use it? You ever see Indiana Jones? You see the end of that when they open it? Like maybe just David does that, like open it and be like, go get him, God. Absalom, you are gone, baby. David has the ark. Use it to rain down righteous judgment on Absalom and end this. But look at what David commands them to do. Verse 25, then the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. What? Why in the world would he order the ark of God to be carried back into the city? Well, to answer this question, I also want to take you back to a story from 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now, this is before the time of David, but let me read this short story to you. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the people came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who was enthroned on the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, which were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, what does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, a god has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. I thought that they had the ark of God. But Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell, and the ark of God was captured. I wonder, let me ask you a question today. Are you trying to carry the ark, the power and the presence of God along with you for the ride? Are you carrying God with you to use him for your purposes? Or are you letting the ark, God's power and his presence carry you? Which one is it? I need to remind you today, God is not a vessel to be used for your purposes. You're his vessel to be used for his purposes. Listen to this quote. It is in our interest as well as our duty cheerfully to acquiesce in the will of God. Whatever befalls us, let us see God's hand in all events, and that we may not be afraid of what shall be. Let us see all events in God's hand. So instead of using God's power and his presence for his own purposes, look what David does instead. Look what he says in verse 25. The king said, carry the ark back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him. Our God will rescue us from the fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, you will still know that this is the God whom we serve. No gimmicks, no superstitions, no rabbit foot religion, no conning God by pilfering the ark. This is not weak resignation, but robust submission. Here is the freedom of faith in the will of God. All depends on him. If I find grace in Yahweh's eyes, this. But if he says, I do not delight in you, then this. How much sheer relief is there in this? For David does not bear God's burden of what will happen to me. Are you bearing God's burden today of what will happen to me? I know we all tend to do that, don't we? We're programmed to worry, programmed to control, to think we can employ or use God for our own purposes to get what we want. You know, he's a genie in the bottle. Just rub him the right way and you can get what you want. That's not the God who we serve. God is sovereign, and we are not. Being sovereign over all of our outcomes is too big of a job for us. It is. But be reminded today, we serve a God who is bigger than we ever thought he was. So you need to just stop negotiations with the God of all creation and submit to his will. Submit to him. Don't try to control it. Submit to him. In other words, you need to just let it go. Let it go. Let it go and let God be God. That's not your job. Let it go and let God be God. Carry the ark back to the city where it belongs. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But even if he doesn't, but even if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am. Here I am, God. Let him do to me what it seems good to him. Let it go and let God be God. Let it go. Listen to me, whatever you're carrying today, maybe it's regret from a past mistake, surely like David was in that moment. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it's worry, maybe it's fear and anxiety, whatever you are carrying in your life that you were never meant to carry, let it go. Let it go. And let God do what he does best. Reign. Reign. He reigns. You don't. He reigns. You know where Jesus is right now? He is seated at the right hand of God on the throne. So as David told Abiathar and Zadok to put the ark back where it belongs. Some of us need to put Jesus back where he belongs. He's seated on the throne. He's in charge. He's in control. Let him be God. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. He's seated right now. He's seated right now. And he's seated for a reason. That's where he belongs. He's right where you want him to be. That's where he belongs, seated on the throne. He's got it. He's got you. He is upholding the universe by the word of his power right now. And church, you got to let it go because you're not. You're not upholding the universe by the word of your power. You're not even holding up your own life by the word of your own power. You're not in control. And you were never supposed to be. God is. He's sovereign. Let it go. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Let it go. When David ordered the ark to be returned to Jerusalem, he's submitting himself to the grace of God toward him. He let it go. And here's the key to this. This submission to the grace and the sovereignty of God, it didn't lead David to paralysis and inaction. You know, I think sometimes we think, okay, let it go, submit to God, and now I'm just gonna be seated and do nothing. No, that's not it. That's not it. When David submitted himself, it freed him to act, but it freed him to act in the will of God, out of God's power and strength, not his, out of God's power and strength. Why? Because God is not a vessel to be used for your purposes. You're a vessel to be used for his purposes. And he will direct you in the way that you should go, but you've got to submit to him. You got to let it go. You got to let it go. So David, he just let it go. If I find favor, he'll bring me back. But if he says, I do not delight in you, then let him do what seems good to him. Once he let it go, his thinking and his next steps were made clear as he was led by the sovereignty and the grace of God. Verse 27, the king, he also said to Zadok, are you not a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your two sons, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. That was the next step for David in dealing with this situation. He didn't remain inactive. He was active, but now he was active in the will of God, following and being led by the Spirit of God. What do I do next? What do I do next? And even next in the situation, God brings this man named Hushai, who we'll talk about next week, who would actually help David overcome this awful situation with his son Absalom. But you gotta just let it go, and God will direct your paths. Now, I know right now in this room, there's a lot of burdens being carried right now that were never meant to be carried by you. They weren't. You're carrying a lot. You're probably feeling the weight of it. Why? Well, it's hard to let go, isn't it? I can clap my hands and tell you to let it go from the stage, but I know it's hard. I've been there. It's hard to submit to the sovereign will of God. It's hard to just let it go. And so I have one more verse for you that I skipped over. And I wanted to use it to show you why you can be free from those burdens. And hopefully today it will give you some peace that whatever it is in your life, you can let it go. Verse 30, it says, but David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up weeping as they went. Well, thousands of years later, do you know that another king would come to this very place at the Mount of Olives? And you know what he said? At that very place where David submitted to the will of God, this King Jesus would come, and he would say this. And Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed. And look at he prayed. He prayed, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus, our Savior, also submitted to the will of his heavenly Father. Not my will, but yours be done. But in this moment on the Mount of Olives, when Jesus is there, what distinguishes this king from King David was that much of David's sufferings as he's on the Mount of Olives were tied to his own sin, right? But this king, he chose the way of suffering even when he didn't deserve it. He wasn't there suffering because of his own sins. Jesus was blameless, spotless. He had no sin. And yet he still submitted to the will of God, paying the price for our sin, even if it meant submitting to death on a cross. And listen, that's the same God who invites us to cast our burdens on him. That's who you can cast your burdens on, not an impersonal, in the sky thing. You get to let it go to Jesus. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And look at this verse. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? That's why today you can have the peace to let it go. Do you know who you're letting it go to? The same one who suffered and died in your place. The same one who wept on the Mount of Olives, for he would take your sin and shame upon himself and take it for you. That's who you can cast your burdens on today. We can let it go today to a good God, to a God who knows us, to a God who loves us. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? That's why you can just let it go. He's gonna give it all back to you. It will be returned. He is your salvation. Let it go. Let it all go. He's got you. He's got you. He's got you because he loves you. He loves you. Let it go. I want to end our time together. As David flees Jerusalem and ascends up the Mount of Olives, he wrote these words found in Psalm chapter 3. He said, "Oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept, and I woke up again. You'll wake up again. For the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. And then he says this at the end, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Salvation belongs to the Lord. That's why you can let it go. Let it go. May God give you his peace today, his freedom, and may you rest today in the Father's hands. Leave the rest in the Father's hands. He's bigger than you ever thought he was. Just let it all go.